He had owned the truck for less than 24 hours when the guns came out. No warning, no knock at the door, just red and blue light filling his rearview mirror and a voice over a loudspeaker telling him to put both hands where they could be seen. This is the story of a man who did everything right. He walked into a dealership, signed the paperwork, drove off the lot in a truck he'd worked for and paid for. And within a day, he was on his knees on a stretch of pavement in Tamarac, Florida, with more than one firearm pointed at his back, because somewhere between the dealership's front desk and a police dispatcher's screen, his new truck had become a stolen one. He wasn't a suspect who got unlucky. He was a United States Coast Guard officer. And for the better part of an afternoon, none of that mattered, because the system in front of him had already decided what he was before he ever said a word. This is what happens when a paperwork mistake meets a felony stop. And this is what it actually costs the person standing in the middle of it. Buying a vehicle is supposed to be one of the more mundane transactions in adult life. You negotiate a price, you sign a stack of forms you don't fully read, you hand over a down payment or trade in your old set of keys, and you drive away the owner of something you didn't own an hour earlier. It's a process so routine that dealerships run dozens of them a week, and buyers rarely think twice about what happens on the paperwork side once the handshake is over. Behind that handshake, though, is a chain of administrative steps most buyers never see. A sale has to be recorded internally. Financing has to be confirmed with a lender. Title work has to be processed. And somewhere in that chain, depending on the dealership, the state, and the systems involved, a vehicle's status can be updated in databases that police departments query in real time from a laptop mounted on a patrol car dashboard. Those databases don't know the difference between a car that was stolen off a lot overnight and a car that was sold that same day to a legitimate buyer with financing approved and a contract signed. They only know what's been entered. If nobody updates the entry, the database doesn't correct itself. It just sits there, waiting for someone to run a plate. That's what happened at a dealership in Broward County, Florida, in the final days of June 2025. A man walked in, picked out a new truck, and went through the process that hundreds of thousands of Americans go through every month. He signed the sales contract. He arranged the financing. He drove off the lot legally with every piece of paperwork a buyer is supposed to have. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that somewhere inside the dealership's own systems, a mistake was being made, or had already been made and never corrected. The vehicle he had just legally purchased was, according to at least one internal or law enforcement-facing record, still flagged in a way that treated it as unaccounted for. Or worse, as if it had been taken from the lot. Court filings in the civil suit that would eventually follow allege exactly this: that the dealership's negligence in handling the paperwork or reporting associated with the sale is what set the next 24 hours in motion. Whether it was a clerical error, a miscommunication between departments, a form that was never filed, or a report that was made and simply never corrected once the truck sold, the effect downstream was identical, somewhere in a system that officers can query from the front seat of a patrol car. This man's new truck was sitting there flagged as a vehicle that shouldn't be on the road. He drove home that night with no idea that a flag like that even existed. He had no reason to think it would. As far as he understood his own life, the transaction was closed. He had a bill of sale. He had a set of keys that were legally his. Nothing about the last 24 hours suggested that anything was unresolved. There's very little that separates the morning of July 1st, 2025 from any other morning for this man. He was a serving member of the United States Coast Guard, a branch of the armed forces most people associate with search and rescue missions, maritime law enforcement, and long-demanding deployments, rather than with anything resembling criminal activity. He had a job that required trust as a baseline condition of employment. He had, the day before, made a large and completely legal purchase, the kind of purchase that's supposed to represent stability. A new truck, financed properly, driven off a dealership lot with a signature and a handshake. He was driving in Tamarac, a city in Broward County, going about whatever business that day required, when a patrol vehicle fell in behind him. For most drivers, that moment, lights in the mirror, triggers a familiar, low-grade anxiety. Did I speed? Is a taillight out? It's the kind of moment that, 99 times out of 100, resolves in under 10 minutes with a license check, maybe a warning, and you're back on the road. Nothing in his experience up to that point would have told him this was going to be the 100th time. Body-worn camera footage later obtained through a public records request tells the rest of the story in granular, real-time detail. The kind of footage that doesn't lie about tone, even when the underlying facts are still being sorted out in real time by everyone involved, including the officers. What officers were responding to was not a routine traffic stop. It was what's classified in law enforcement procedure as a high-risk stop, sometimes called a felony stop. The protocol reserved for situations where a vehicle or its occupant is believed to be connected to a serious crime, most commonly an armed offense, or, as in this case, a stolen vehicle. High-risk stops are trained and executed differently from the moment they begin. Officers don't approach the driver's window and ask for a license. They stay behind cover. They give commands over a loudspeaker, not through the window. And the commands are designed to remove any ambiguity about compliance. Hands out the window, don't move, turn off the engine, open the door from the outside, step out and walk backward toward the sound of the officer's voice. For the man behind the wheel, none of it tracked with anything he understood about his own situation. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't hiding anything. As far as he knew, he was driving a truck he had legally bought less than a day earlier, with the paperwork to prove it likely still sitting in the glove box or on the passenger seat. But understanding that, and getting officers who have just been told they may be dealing with a stolen vehicle to accept it in the first 60 seconds of a felony stop, are two entirely different problems. In a stop like this, officers aren't trained to take a suspect's word for anything in the opening moments. They're trained to secure the scene first, hands visible, subject restrained, scene controlled, and sort out the underlying facts second. He was ordered to the ground. He was handcuffed. And for a period of time that, by accounts of the incident, stretched into hours, he sat in the back of a patrol car while officers worked to confirm what he had apparently already known from the very beginning, that the truck was his, legally, completely, and without dispute. It's worth pausing on exactly who this happened to, because it sharpens the irony at the center of the case, rather than softening it. Service in the United States Coast Guard isn't a casual commitment. It requires a background investigation before enlistment. It requires a security clearance process for many roles. It requires the kind of institutional trust that the federal government extends only after vetting someone's history, their finances, their associations, and their character. Whatever else is true about this man, the country had already, through a formal process, decided he was trustworthy enough to serve in an armed federal service, one that boards vessels, enforces maritime law, and in some roles carries a weapon on behalf of the United States government. None of that mattered on the side of the road in Tamarac. It couldn't have. The officers responding to a stolen vehicle report had no way of knowing his service record, his clearance history, or anything else about who he was beyond what a database was telling them about the truck he was driving. That's not a criticism of the officers. It's simply the nature of a felony stop. The person behind the wheel is, for the first several minutes, defined entirely by the report that triggered the response, not by anything true about their actual life. A Coast Guard officer and a car thief look identical from behind a drawn firearm at the start of a high-risk stop. The system isn't built to tell them apart until later. That's exactly what makes the underlying accuracy of the report the only thing standing between an ordinary Tuesday and an afternoon in handcuffs. This is the part of the case that legal analysts have focused on most closely because it sits directly on top of one of the more contested lines in American criminal procedure: the line between an investigative detention and a de facto arrest. The Fourth Amendment allows police to briefly detain someone based on reasonable suspicion, a lower standard than the probable cause required for an arrest. In theory, a detention is supposed to be limited in scope and duration, brief, minimally intrusive, no longer than is reasonably necessary to confirm or dispel the officer's suspicion. An arrest is a different legal category entirely, requiring probable cause and triggering a stronger set of constitutional protections, including, in most circumstances, Miranda warnings before any custodial interrogation. In practice, when you are face down on pavement with a firearm trained on you, and then handcuffed, and then placed in the back of a patrol car for what stretches into hours while officers work a phone in a database, the legal label attached to what's happening to you does very little to change how it feels while it's happening. Tactically, officers can point to a stolen vehicle report as justification for treating a stop as high risk from the outset, and courts have historically given law enforcement significant latitude in these situations, reasoning that officer safety justifies caution when a vehicle is reported stolen. Because in a meaningful percentage of those calls, the vehicle genuinely is, and the driver genuinely is dangerous. But that latitude exists because the system assumes the underlying report is accurate. This case is what happens when that assumption, the one the entire legal framework is built on top of, turns out to be the thing that's wrong. For hours, according to accounts of the incident, the man sat in the back of a patrol vehicle while the truth of his own recent history, a legal purchase, completed the day before at a business a few miles away, with a paper trail that existed the moment he signed it, worked its way through phone calls, database checks, and verification with the dealership itself. Every minute of that wait was a minute in which he was, by any practical measure, not free to leave, not free to explain himself in a way that carried any weight, and not presumed innocent so much as he was presumed guilty until his own paperwork could catch up to the situation he was sitting in. Any legal evaluation of a stop like this eventually runs into the same question. Was the level of force used objectively reasonable, given what the officers knew at the time? That standard, objective reasonableness, is the backbone of how courts evaluate police use of force in the United States. It doesn't ask whether the force turned out, in hindsight, to have been necessary. It asks whether a reasonable officer, possessing the same information available in the moment, would have responded the same way. Hindsight is explicitly excluded from the analysis because the law recognizes that officers have to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, often in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. Judged by that standard, a stolen vehicle report is about as strong a justification for a high-risk stop as exists short of an active violent crime in progress. Vehicle theft calls carry real, well-documented danger for responding officers. Stolen vehicles are disproportionately connected to other crimes in progress, and drivers fleeing in a stolen vehicle have, in other incidents, used the vehicle itself as a weapon against pursuing officers. None of that was true here, but the officers arriving on scene had no way to know that in the first 60 seconds, and the standard doesn't require them to know it. It only requires them to act reasonably on the information the dispatch system gave them. This is precisely why the tactical evaluation of this stop and the accountability question point in two different directions. Tactically, treating this as a high-risk stop was defensible, maybe even correct, given the report in the system. But accountability doesn't stop at the officers who responded reasonably to bad information. It has to travel further upstream to whoever entered that information and whoever failed to correct it once the truck legally changed hands. The lawsuit's decision to bypass the sheriff's office entirely and go straight at the dealership isn't just a legal strategy. It's an accurate read of where, in a chain of individually defensible decisions, the actual failure occurred. Eventually, the truck's ownership was verified. Exactly how long that took, and exactly which calls had to be made to unwind the error, a conversation with the dealership, a records check, a supervisor's sign-off, isn't laid out second by second in what's publicly available. What is clear is that it took time. Real time, measured in hours, not minutes. Time spent in handcuffs, on a public street, while officers who had done nothing wrong by the book worked to correct a mistake that wasn't theirs to begin with, made by a business that, by the time any of this reached him, had no idea its own paperwork was the reason a man was on the ground. Once the ownership was confirmed and the stolen vehicle report was traced back to its source, he was released. No charges were filed because there had never been a crime committed by anyone at the center of this stop, only a mistake made upstream by someone he'd never met, in a department he never dealt with directly, that reached him in the most physical, most frightening form a paperwork error can take. One detail worth sitting with. By all accounts, this incident ended without physical injury. The officers who responded followed a high-risk stop protocol that is, by design, meant to protect everyone on scene, the officers and the person being stopped, precisely because no one standing at the point of contact can know in the first 10 seconds whether a stolen vehicle report is accurate. From a pure use of force and tactical standpoint, this is close to the outcome the protocol is built to produce. No shots fired, no physical struggle, a controlled detention that ends in release once facts are confirmed. It would be easy to end the story there. No one hurt. Case closed. Move on. But an afternoon spent at gunpoint, handcuffed and held for hours over a truck you legitimately own, doesn't end the moment the cuffs come off. There's the drive home in a vehicle you now look at differently, at least for a while. There's the retelling, to a spouse, to friends, to colleagues on a base or a cutter, of the day a legal purchase turned into a felony stop. There's the simple corrosive knowledge that a piece of paperwork filled out by someone else, filed by someone else, never double-checked by anyone before it reached a police database, was enough to put him on his knees on a public street in front of drawn weapons. That kind of harm doesn't show up on an incident report. It doesn't require stitches or a hospital visit. It shows up later in smaller ways, in how a person reacts the next time a car pulls in close behind them, in how much trust they extend, going forward to institutions that are supposed to get the small, boring administrative details right, precisely so that scenes like this don't happen to people who did nothing wrong. The civil lawsuit that followed doesn't ask a court to weigh in on whether the responding officers acted appropriately, and it doesn't name the sheriff's office as a defendant at all. That's a deliberate choice, and it tells you where the filing believes the actual failure occurred. Instead, the suit goes directly to the dealership. The filing alleges negligence, false imprisonment, and emotional distress, a set of claims that together amount to a legal argument that a business's administrative failure, however unintentional, caused specific, real, and provable harm to a specific person, and that the business, not the police department that responded to a report it had every reason to believe, should be the one to answer for it in court. Negligence in a case like this would need to show that the dealership owed a duty of care in how it processed and reported the sale, that it breached that duty by allowing an inaccurate, stolen vehicle status to persist, and that the breach directly caused the harm that followed. False imprisonment, as a claim against a party that was nowhere near the actual scene of the detention, rests on the theory that the dealership's actions were the proximate cause of a restraint on his liberty, that the officers, in effect, became the instrument of a mistake that originated somewhere else entirely. And emotional distress speaks for itself. The psychological weight of an experience like this doesn't require a broken bone to be real or to be compensable. The dealership, for its part, has moved to compel arbitration, a common legal maneuver in consumer disputes, and one worth understanding on its own terms. Arbitration clauses are frequently buried in the fine print of sales contracts and financing agreements, and they generally require disputes to be resolved through a private arbitration process rather than a public jury trial. For a business, that often means a lower cost, lower visibility, and statistically more favorable venue than open court. For a plaintiff, it can mean giving up the right to a jury of peers, the transparency of a public docket, and in many cases, the ability to appeal an unfavorable outcome the way a court ruling can be appealed. Whether that clause holds up and whether this dispute ultimately gets resolved behind closed doors or in front of a judge is still working its way through the legal process. It's worth stepping back from this single case to look at the system it exposes. Stolen vehicle reporting sits at an unglamorous intersection of retail paperwork and law enforcement databases. The National Crime Information Center and its state-level counterparts, fed by a mix of police reports, dealership records, and financial institution updates. It's a system built to move fast because when a car actually is stolen, speed is what allows an officer 3 states away to recognize a plate and make a recovery. But the same speed that makes the system useful when it's accurate is exactly what makes it dangerous when it's wrong, because there's very little friction between a bad entry and an officer treating that entry as gospel at the side of a road. This case isn't the first time an administrative error has escalated into a high-risk stop for someone who had done nothing wrong, and without structural changes to how quickly incorrect entries get corrected, it's unlikely to be the last. The individual officers on scene that day in Tamarac followed a protocol built for the information they were given. The information itself is where this case actually breaks down. There's a broader question sitting underneath this specific case, one worth asking even though this particular story has already reached its resolution. What happens to the next person this happens to if that person doesn't have a Coast Guard service record, doesn't have a clean history, or simply reacts to fear and confusion in a way that reads, in the moment, as a non-compliance? This case ended the way it did in part because the man at the center of it understood, even in the middle of an extraordinarily frightening situation, that compliance was his only path back to safety and resolution. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't make a sudden movement that could have been misread by an officer whose adrenaline was already elevated by a stolen vehicle call. Every account of the incident suggests he did exactly what he needed to do to survive an encounter he never should have been in. Not everyone reacts that way under that kind of pressure, and the law doesn't require perfect composure from someone who has just been pulled from their vehicle at gunpoint over a mistake they didn't make. A different person, a different day, a different set of split-second reactions, and a story that ended with a lawsuit over emotional distress could have ended very differently. That gap between how this case actually resolved and how easily it could have gone another way is part of what makes the underlying systemic failure worth taking seriously, independent of how any one individual case turns out. There's a temptation in stories like this to look for a villain wearing a badge. It's the more familiar shape for this kind of story to take. The one true crime coverage defaults to almost automatically. But the body-worn camera footage here doesn't show officers behaving recklessly. It shows officers following a protocol built for exactly the kind of ambiguous, high-stakes situation a stolen vehicle report creates. A protocol that, by the standards used to judge these things, was executed defensibly. Which is precisely what makes this case worth sitting with longer than the average headline allows. The failure wasn't a bad actor making a bad decision in the field. The failure was upstream, a piece of paperwork, a database entry, a step in a sales process that either wasn't completed or wasn't corrected. And by the time it reached the street, it had already been converted into flashing lights, drawn weapons, and a pair of handcuffs on a man who had done nothing wrong except buy a truck and drive it home. He got his truck. He was released. He was never charged, and by every available account, he wasn't physically hurt. On paper, in the narrowest possible reading, the system worked exactly as designed. Reasonable suspicion, a brief investigative detention, verification, release, no lasting legal consequence to the person at the center of it. But paperwork doesn't measure what it actually costs to be on the wrong end of a system that's only as accurate as the last person who touched the file. It doesn't measure the hours spent on the pavement, the retelling of the story to people who wince when they hear it, or what it does to the quiet, ordinary trust most of us extend without thinking. The assumption that buying something and owning it are supposed to be the same thing from the moment you sign. That's the case. Not a crime committed, but a cost paid by someone who never should have had to pay it, and a lawsuit now asking who exactly should have to answer for that.